art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate effect, but also the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists of tracing the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups.
From the new home of Bitcoin and all things blockchain, Peckham, South London. This is the Genesis Block Education Podcast, and I am none other than Bitcoin by Malks. Welcome. Before we get into the show, I want to thank everybody who is continually tuning into this show, downloading on YouTube. Thank you for your time and thank you for your continued support. But I'm going to ask one favor. Well, a few favors actually. If you listen to the podcast and you find it of value, please like, please share, please comment, and please give us the motivation to keep going and keep creating this content. With your impetus and with your support, we'll push on, we'll improve, and we'll be better. Now, on to today's show. So on my Bitcoin journey, one thing I've continually bumped into is economics and ideas about economics. And although I have a background in finance, I also actually studied economics at A-level and I got a C. I did okay. And a C back in the day is probably equivalent to an A star right about now. They just give A stars away in this current age. Anyway, I just thought, you know what? I want to bring someone onto this show who's going to talk about the principles and the economics that fundamentally underpin Bitcoin. Now, there's many names in the space. There's Stephen Livera, there's Robert Breedlove, there's even Vijay Boyapati and his brilliant paper, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. But I came across this young South African brother by the name of Bheki Mahlobo, and I said, I'm going to get this kid on. So how did I bump into Bheki? So I watched a documentary called Banking on Africa, A Bitcoin Revolution, and it's from 2020. A really good documentary that kind of shows the growing uptake of Bitcoin on the African continent. And that's something that we've talked about on this show before. Now, one of the people featured in this documentary was a young Bheki. Now, I saw this guy with his Air Max, his socks rolled up, and his shorts. But this kid's grasp of fundamental economic principles was so impressive for someone that age. I thought, I'm going to try and reach out to him, even though he's on the other side of the world. So I reached out to him. I said, hey, do you want to do a show? And Bheki was like, yeah. Now, Bheki was hard to get hold of because he's a really busy guy, but we managed to pull it off. As you're probably going to conclude from the show, this is a really smart young kid and he's probably going to go on to do big things. So I think I've given more than enough away. Let's get on to the show. Over to you, Bheki.
So Bheki, welcome. How are you doing today? How is your day, Bheki?
My day is kind of hectic today. It's a Sunday, so chilling with the family. Quite hectic, but chilled as well. So going well. How's yours going?
Yeah, not too bad. It's a Sunday, and I'm joined with you to have a great conversation around Bitcoin and economics. But what part of the world are you in? Let's get an idea of where you are in the world.
So I live in Johannesburg, which is the capital city of South Africa. That's where I am. I'm from South Africa.
What's the weather like at this time of the year?
Okay, so it depends where you are, because right here in Johannesburg it's quite hot today. It's extremely hot, so that's why I'm drinking a lot of water and staying hydrated. But
Right.
then I was in like Cape Town, just this past weekend. Cape Town is in Western Cape, which is another province here in South Africa, and they have weird weather. The sun can be out, but you have like cold winds. So
Yeah.
I've learned that if you're in the Cape, which is close to the ocean,
Yeah.
gonna have like really cold weather. But if you're close, like if you're in Johannesburg or Gauteng, which is a province here in South Africa, it'll be quite hot. So it is hot, very hot today. So I'm just drinking a lot of water with ice and whatnot.
Yeah, I definitely need to get over to South Africa. I think we were discussing earlier, and I was saying how much I'm into South African house music. It's the only thing I listen to. I've stopped listening to hip hop. I stopped listening to everything. It's only South African house music that I listen to. It's the only music that I find that is uplifting. It gets me kind of on a positive vibe in gym, whether it's Black Coffee, Black Motion. It's a really good vibe. So I need to come out.
You definitely need to pull pull through. I'll show you the city. I'll show you places here in South Africa. Yeah.
We definitely hook that up down the line. But today we are here to talk about Bitcoin and economics. Before we could jump into it, Becky, introduce yourself. Tell the
Right.
people who you are.
Yeah. So, to your listeners, I'm an ordinary BCom economics student in my final year. I mainly am interested in a school of thought called the Austrian School of Economic Thought, which is something we're going to discuss further in this podcast. But I basically got introduced to it in high school, and that basically shaped me for the next few years. I got deeply interested, started reading a lot, and that's how I got interested into Bitcoin. It was through economics, from an economic lens, mainly reading the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous. But yeah, like to sum it up, I'm just an ordinary student and an economics student, and I guess I'm a very chill person.
So, Becky, I came across you personally on the Banking on Africa, the Bitcoin Revolution
Right,
documentary, and I was just
right.
super impressed by the way you articulated your ideas around Bitcoin and economics. What motivated you to go down this route of understanding Bitcoin and its economics?
It was a personal interest, mainly because I was really frustrated with a lot of what's going on with fiat currency. Fiat currency, I mean like government paper. Uh, I'm very much interested into saving my money. That's why I was interested in gold. And so what essentially got me interested into Bitcoin was how easy it is to firstly buy it and store it, and the fact that it is sound money, which is the term that I can explain.
Yeah.
But essentially, what got me interested into Bitcoin was the sound money aspect of it, and the fact that I was like very fed up with government money. The government money always losing value each year. This
Yeah,
is a trend that I've seen in other countries around the world,
of course.
and yeah, that's basically it. That's basically the reason why.
So before we tackle those topics, let's take a step back and just look at economics as a theoretical framework. So I studied economics in my sort of formative years in A levels. We have A levels in the UK. I don't think I did. Well, I did okay. So again, I got an I got an understanding of basic economics concepts, and the key name that sticks in my head when I think about economics is Keynes. Is it John Keynes? John Maynard? Yeah, Keynes.
Yeah, yeah,
But
John
yeah,
Maynard Keynes. Yeah.
from a global perspective, what is the traditional form of economics that we are taught across the globe?
Yeah, so the mainstream school of thought being taught at universities is Keynesian economics. That's the one that you just mentioned there, and it's basically Keynesian economics. If I would describe Keynesian economics, it's about essentially stimulating aggregate demand. In other words, stimulating spending. It's completely ignoring the important role that savings play in an economy.
Okay.
Everything is about consumption. Everything is about using debt to consume. And the reason why I don't view it as sound economics is mainly because it only looks at things in the short term and not in the long term.
Mm.
So that's unfortunately the main school of thought being taught at universities.
So, Becky, I've done a bit of research on this, and it appears that Keynesian economics really came into prominence after World War II. And this was at a time where the US had established itself as a superpower, and the US dollar became the reserve currency of the whole world as a result of the Bretton Woods Agreement. Since then, Keynesian economics has effectively become the prominent school of economics, and it's been, I guess, perpetuated and taught in schools and academic institutions across the globe for nearly 70 years now. Why is this form of economics so popular?
Yeah, so the main reason why I think it's so popular is because it speaks the language of governments around the world.
Right. Okay.
Uh, I mean, like the whole thing of essentially cutting interest rates, increasing government spending, that benefits government a lot. If you see like governments like to get bigger. I mean, if we can use this crisis or this pandemic, quote unquote, as an example, like they just got bigger. We saw a lot of stimulus, a lot of Keynesian stimulus, saw a lot of cutting of interest rates around the world,
Mhm.
a lot of governments going to debt. And so that's Keynesian economics, and government benefits a lot from that. Government benefits a lot from the devaluation of its currency through the way of paying its debt. It's a lot cheaper to pay off its debt if the currency is devaluing each and every year. So that's the language that Keynesian economics speaks. It says that there's a failure in markets
Right.
and government needs to step in, and government likes to hear that.
So am I right in saying that Keynesian economics is focused around centrally planned economies where a government utilizes fiscal and monetary policies to manage an economy? Is that correct?
That is the case. It is essentially centralized planning. You have a bunch of few government officials deciding which direction the economy should take or what they think it should take. We could use central banking as example. The whole thing of setting interest rates for everyone to follow. That's centrally planning. Economic policies derived by government that are top down. That's centrally planning through regulation, through intervention. So it's mostly centrally planned. So if I would draw a distinction between Austrian economics and Keynesian economics is mostly focused on centralized planning. Austrian economics is mostly focused on decentralized planning.
Can you give a brief overview of Austrian economics and what it is?
Yeah, sure. So I like to use an economist by the name of Henry Hazlitt to essentially explain what Austrian economics is, and it's essentially the art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate effect but also the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists of tracing the consequences of that policy not merely for one group but for all groups.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's the definition that I like to use for Austrian economics. A lot of people use different definitions, and that's completely fine. But that's my favorite underpinning of what Austrian economics is. But looking at the short term and the long term consequences of any economic policy or government policy on all groups, not just on one group, essentially.
So Becky, what do you see as the major problems with Keynesian economics? Firstly, governments that implement policies based on Keynesian economics and government controlled monetary supply, i.e., fiat currencies. What do you see as the major problems?
With Keynesian economics, there's a lot of contradictions with Keynesian economics. I can use an example of defining what economic growth is.
Okay.
With Keynesians, they view inflation as sort of necessary for there to be economic growth.
Yeah.
The central bank needs to cut interest rates, they need to print money and inject new stimulus into the economy so that people spend. If people spend, aggregate demand goes up, businesses produce more, they become productive according to them, and the economy grows. So inflation, which is essentially, if you think about inflation, inflation is an invisible tax. Each and every year, your currency devalues. They view that as necessary for there to be economic growth. Whereas the Austrians would say that no, that's wrong. In fact, you don't need inflation for there to be economic growth. It is in fact the definition of economic growth. It is deflationary. I mean, if you define what economic growth is, it essentially is the increase in production. In other words, the increase in supply of goods and services in a particular country or region. So a perfect example that I like to use is that of technologies and cell phones.
Yeah.
The more you see like a lot of different designs, the more you see a lot of different innovations, different products, the more people contribute to cell phones, for example, the supply of it increases, and that causes prices to go down. That's economic growth. It's an increase in the standard of living for people. So how it leads to an increase in standard of living for people is essentially the decrease in prices makes it affordable for essentially everyone, even the poor, to get access to cell phones.
Sure.
And there's a lot of examples of this. You can use cell phones, you can use memory cards, you can use plane tickets. Yeah. So things in general are supposed to get cheaper over time.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
is there any country on the planet which actually applies Austrian economics, or is this all theory?
Not that I see that there's a country that applies Austrian economics to a T. One of the things that I was actually encouraged to look at is that some of these countries, they don't necessarily impose Austrian economics, but they impose free market-based policies. So rather than like a socialist government, they mostly impose free markets, encouraging entrepreneurs, being business friendly. A perfect index that you can look at this is the Economic Freedom Index, which ranks countries according to economic freedom that they have in each country. So Austrian economics is essentially a way of looking at economic thought. It's a perspective of economics. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the way of looking at economics essentially. So I wouldn't say that there's a country right now that imposes Austrian economics, but there are countries that are more free market orientated compared to others.
So just slightly moving on from economics and sort of the theoretical framework, I remember in the documentary you had some bad words to say about fractional reserve banking. So let's dive into that a little bit. What is fractional reserve banking? So I'm a normal guy on the street. Can you explain that to me?
Fractional reserve banking is essentially when a bank tells you that, let's say for example, you have £1,000 in your bank account,
Sure.
And it tells you when you look at your app, if you have internet banking, you see that you have £1,000 in your bank account.
Yeah.
But that's not the case. You only have a fraction of that amount in that bank, in that bank vault essentially, or in that bank essentially. And the bank is essentially loaned out the rest to other people or other businesses essentially. And it's able to do that if there's not a lot of people withdrawing money from the bank, and the fact that there's a central bank behind that. If you have, for example, a lot of people withdrawing, going to the bank and withdrawing money from the bank.
So a run on the bank.
If you have a run on the bank, for example, then there will be problems. Then it won't be able to pay you that £1,000 that you have in your account. In fact, it will suspend payments or withdrawals to you and wait for a central bank to essentially bail it out. That's what we saw during 2008 and other examples in history.
So by bailout, do you mean essentially just print money out of thin air?
Money, yeah. They print money. They print money out of thin air, and they essentially give it to the commercial banks, and the commercial banks hand it out to people trying to withdraw their money.
So how does fractional reserve banking link in with, I guess, the traditional form of economics that we have in society? Is there a link between the two, or are they just two standalone things?
There's a deep link between the two, because fractional reserve banking is inflationary. The very act of central banks essentially doing fractional reserve banking, engaging in fractional reserve banking, is creating currency essentially, and creating new currency in economy increases prices. That's Keynesian economics.
Right.
Also, I believe it was Keynes himself that said that you need to encourage people to spend. So if you encourage people how you encourage people to spend, essentially you devalue their currency. If your currency devalues each and every year, you are mostly likely to spend more than you would save. Like if you think about it, if your income the next year is not the same as the previous year, why hold on to it? So you'd rather spend it on something, and not save it.
How does the gold standard, or removal of the gold standard, how did it bring us to where we are today? What is the gold standard, I guess, is the first point. Some people may not know what the gold standard is. Yeah.
The gold standard was essentially a standard in which currency was backed up by gold. £100 in your wallet was £100 worth of gold in a bank's vault. So therefore 100% reserved, no fractional reserve banking there. And so that was essentially sound money there. Gold is sound money. And what I need to define what sound money is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sound money is essentially money which is determined by the market. Money that is determined by people to be useful to them to do their daily functions. There were many examples of this, but one of the qualities of money is that it needs to be exchangeable, it needs to be fungible, unit of account, all those properties.
Yep.
But the important one with sound money is that it needs to be a store of value. right? And by store of value, what I mean by this is that it maintains its value over time and slightly increases its value over the long term. So that was essentially the gold standard. You had no inflation within the gold standard. Prices were stable, and in fact, over time, prices decreased. And what happened subsequent to that is that you had an increase in prices. Prices were not stable. You had high inflationary periods in some of these countries. Venezuela, Zimbabwe is an example of this, where currencies were just completely devaluing in value. And that's the consequence of going off the gold standard, is that you had essentially the centralization of money by governments, in which they were able to print money out of nothing. That's the consequences. That's a consequence of us moving away from the gold standard.
And why would a government move away from the gold standard if it was so great back then? Why would a government move away from it?
Yeah, so the thing with governments is that they like to get bigger.
Right.
With the gold standard, essentially, it put a restriction on. It put a restriction on. Like, they couldn't print money out of thin air to pay off their debts, so it was very strict on them. And it was strict on them in the sense that it could maintain the size of them. They couldn't spend or they couldn't go over indebtedness, or they couldn't spend more than what they received in tax revenue. And so that's the whole reason why they benefit so much out of fiat currency, because they're able to do those things right now. They're able to go in massive amounts of debt, which we've seen this year. They're able to print money out of thin air to essentially finance their daily expenditures. In fact, we even had our own deputy minister quite recently, I think 2 months ago, that stated that the Central Bank of South Africa should print money and buy government bonds, mainly because it helps the government to finance their daily expenditures, to pay off social welfare, to pay off government expenditure, the service delivery and whatnot.
So you mentioned Zimbabwe and Venezuela as countries which have had chronic sort of hyperinflation and devaluations of their currencies. Would you say that that is something that could potentially happen for all fiat currencies? So why are currencies, let's say like the British pound or the US dollar, why are they not in the same position as, say, Zimbabwe? Is it a sliding scale where all countries will end up at that point if they continue with fiat currencies?
Like, what makes countries differ on this scale?
Yeah, so it's different with every country. There are steps to hyperinflation. Essentially, the final step of hyperinflation is when the citizen of that country essentially lose all confidence in the currency.
Okay.
With Zimbabwe, you had a lot of people immediately as soon as they earned their income, they would spend it in something else. So you can imagine when the central bank prints, let's say, 100 billion pounds in a given time, and injects that into the economy, and people spend that as soon as they receive that in the economy, you'll see an escalation in prices. That essentially is the final step of hyperinflation, is when citizens of a particular country lose all faith in the currency. They say, oh dang, this thing is going to devalue now. I only have an hour left to essentially spend, and quickly spend. And that's what happens. That's what happened in Venezuela. That's what happened in Zimbabwe. So I believe the reason why some of these countries have not went through that phase yet is that, first of all, I don't think they're printing as much as what Zimbabwe and Venezuela did, and secondly, there's a lot of confidence behind the US dollar. There's a lot of hedge funds, investment banks using the dollar, so there's a lot of liquidity within the dollar. There's a lot of confidence in the dollar. So that's a real reason why we're not seeing that.
So in terms of national sovereign currencies, how much is a country's or the strength of a country's currency dependent on a country's population belief in that currency? Is money a psychological thing?
I can't really define it yet, but then the thing with money is that it guides human decision. It does not determine it, but it does have an impact on it. If your currency loses value each and every year, you're going to act different ways. Like you're going to be more inclined to spend more than you're going to save. So if you have a period in which prices are constantly going up and up on a daily basis, then you're going to be more inclined to spend what you have to spend on what you have right now, because if you wait a little longer, it'll be a lot less than what you received it. So I cannot define what period that is, but then it is essentially the period in which people are mostly inclined to spend it right now, then wait a little bit longer. That's the final step of hyperinflation.
You spoke earlier about the South African government making announcements about potentially, I guess, printing more money. In a nutshell, what has been the the government of South Africa's reaction to the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, like with any other country, we introduce stimulus.
Yeah, yeah.
So with us, okay, so with us, let me break it down as well. With us, the government stated that there's 500 billion worth of government stimulus, of which some of that amount was repurchased from their pre-existing budget, which means that they took funds that they were supposed to spend on other things and they essentially allocated to this COVID fund. That's what they call it. And some of that was going to be made of loan guarantees and whatnot. So essentially what happened is that our government, from a fiscal side of things, took money that was supposed to be spent on other things and allocated to COVID, as well as started selling bonds in order to purchase, in order to essentially get the funds for that stimulus. So
Yeah.
we went into more debt by that. We had an increase in government spending. We had a contracting economy, which resulted in our debt skyrocketing. I mean, in our last financial year, our debt was sitting at 62% as a proportion of GDP. Now it's projected to be around 85% as a proportion of GDP. That's a 20% increase in the national debt in just
Wow.
1 year.
Wow.
That is crazy.
Wow.
That is just absolutely crazy. And with that, we also face a risk, and that risk is that of inflation, of hyperinflation. There's a I'll get this for you. I'll send it to you after this. But essentially, for every 40 rand that the government borrows and spends it within the economy, there's a risk that there's hyperinflation in the coming years. I need to remember the economist had said this. I'm very bad at remembering some of these economists, but essentially, South African government is running out of fiscal room to continue what it's doing. It's running out of government revenue, and in order to get that revenue, they're looking into other streams to get that funds. They're looking at nationalizing the central bank in order to own the central bank and print more currency out of it. They're looking at doing what's called prescribed assets, which is essentially to take retirement funds, to take pension funds, to take them out of the private sector and to use them in government expenditure. Essentially stealing retirement funds.
Wow.
So that's the horrible situation that we're in.
What are the downstream impacts to the everyday South African as a result of these initiatives?
So unfortunately, the consequences of this are very negative for the ordinary South African. If, for example, the government goes ahead with prescribed assets, which I explained earlier, it means that essentially retirement funds will be devalued. That means that you've been working your whole life, 10 years or more, and by the time you retire, you essentially almost have nothing to your name. If they nationalize the central bank, or if they somehow influence the central bank to print more currency, that unfortunately means that there'll be higher prices in South African goods. That means that your purchasing power will be a lot less when you buy stuff, when you buy food for your family, when you want to travel, perhaps it will be more expensive. Maybe you'll be less inclined to travel. So essentially things are going to get a lot more expensive for the ordinary South African if this happens. If I were to explain to you what's currently happening within the South African government, is that they're mostly turning towards centralization. They essentially want to be the father of the South African citizen. They want to be in control of every aspect of the ordinary South African. I mean, there's so many regulations coming through right now. It's absolutely crazy. They want to essentially even though they don't say it, but essentially they want to nationalize the land or be custodianship of land, which means that if so, let me explain it right now. Last week, the government essentially came up with a bill called the expropriation bill, which would allow any government entity to essentially take someone's property without compensating them.
Wow.
If it happens, if it's passed through the parliament and the parliament approves, it will allow government to essentially take someone's land. Let's say you have a granny, for example, and she owns a house, and the government would like to take that house. There's absolutely close to nothing that granny can do to essentially prevent that. So it is completely destroying property rights in South Africa. And what I would define property rights is essentially the ability to own what you've worked for, to own what you've worked hard for,
Yeah.
Exactly. So the government here is trying to essentially destroy your hard work by doing that.
Wow, that is scary.
Yeah, so that's yeah, it's very scary.
So, Bheki, this is a question I always ask everybody who comes onto this podcast. In your words, what is Bitcoin?
That's a good question.
Everybody always says that. That's a good question.
I like to think of Bitcoin as an escape. It's like my escape button. Every time I buy it, every time I'm in an exchange, and I put my fiat currency, I put the rand in there, and I click buy Bitcoin. That's my escape. It's saying like, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing fiat currency. I'd rather have my savings in sound money, where I am fully in control over my savings, where you can't print my currency out of existence, where you can't print my hard work out of existence. So essentially, Bitcoin for me is an escape from all that is wrong with fiat currency.
So is Bitcoin a protest to you, or something much more?
Is it a protest? I believe it is to certain respects. It is a protest, but it's a voluntary protest. You're not forced into it. It's a choice. It's either you. I mean, no one's forced to get into Bitcoin. So yeah, I would say it's a voluntary protest.
How did you get into Bitcoin? How did you hear about it?
Yeah, that's a really long journey.
We got all day. Go ahead.
Yeah, so essentially, my grounding in Bitcoin started by learning the principles of economics. This was through high school when I was introduced to economics in the 10th grade by an economics teacher of mine in high school. There was a week in that year where he introduced us to economics. He talked about central banking, what is money, what is free markets, what is the socialist system, what is communism, and what is sound money. And so it was through that week that I got interested in economics. And unfortunately, a lot of students didn't approve of what he was doing because it wasn't prescribed in the textbook. And some teachers as well were fighting with him. And it almost got him fired for that. So.
Oh, wow. Well, there you go.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. He was introducing us to sound money, to sound economics, but the Keynesians didn't like that. So he stopped doing that, and so I went up to him, me and a few of my mates, and we asked him like, "Yo, can you like share resources? Can you give us some reading material that we can read so that we can follow up on this thing?" And so that's exactly what he did. He gave us a few videos to look at, a few recommendation reading books to look at. Most of those guys were Austrian guys like Mary Rothbard, Henry Hazlitt, Ludwig von Mises. Started deep diving into that, and then I became grounded in Austrian economics. Well, started to get a really deep interest in Austrian economics, and that's when my doubt of Keynesian economics started, and that's when my doubt of central banking as well as fiat currencies happened. And that paved the way to Bitcoin. But the first time I heard about Bitcoin was through a movie called Dope.
Tell me about that movie.
Yeah, so
Okay.
that movie Dope, it basically didn't cover Bitcoin in a positive light. It basically stated that Bitcoin is mainly used to buy drugs or essentially anything illegal.
All right. Okay.
And so when I first got exposed to that, like obviously, like any other person's like, I'm not gonna pay much attention to that anyway. And then eventually, I think I started hearing more and more about it, like from Peter Schiff. He
Oh,
hates
Peter shit.
Bitcoin.
Yeah, the Gold Man.
He hates Bitcoin,
Yeah.
and I listen to his podcast a lot.
I
So
do.
every time
Okay.
he
Okay.
yeah every time he speaks about Bitcoin, right now I buy more Bitcoin. Every time I'm like Bitcoin
The
is
Gold Man.
useless, I'm like,
Yeah.
oh man, that's a signal. I should buy more.
Yeah.
Buy more of that.
That guy.
So there was a period in
Yeah.
which yeah, there was a period in which he was bashing Bitcoin. And so that's when actually I was like, okay, maybe I should look into this more a little bit because
What year? What year are
like
we
actually
talking? What year are we talking? This happened.
I think this was 2017,
Okay, that's quite.
2017
That's
if I'm
quite
not
early.
mistaken.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so it's been quite new. I'm a very newbie.
Oh, yeah. We all are. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it was through that, and then I joined a Telegram group. There's a Bitcoin Telegram group, and I was like, yo, do you guys have any recommendations for me to read on? And someone suggested the Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous. I think that's when it just came out, if I'm not mistaken. And so I grabbed it and I started reading, and I was just like, everything made sense because he incorporated the Austrian principles into Bitcoin, and that's what basically pushed me towards that direction of Bitcoin.
In terms of nuggets from the book, what would you say is the key nugget that really just kind of turned a light bulb on in your head?
The key nugget for me from that book is essentially what's called time preference. Even though I've read it about what time preference is in my previous readings, but the way he explained it in his book was absolutely phenomenal. Essentially, what time preference is, essentially, it's the ratio of how you value the future compared to the present.
Right.
So if you're someone who values today more than tomorrow, you'd be considered someone that has a very high time preference. That means that you're not saving much, you're spending a lot, you're not thinking about the future consequences of your actions, you're not taking responsibility. So that's someone that would be considered a high time preference individual, and things don't go well for that individual. And then you have someone that values the future a lot more, that saves a lot more than saves more than they spend, or saves moderately, that considers the long-term consequences of their actions, and yeah, it's quite a responsible individual, and things go right for that individual. And so the key nugget was the concept of time preference for me, because money plays a very important role in determining or engaging or encouraging someone's time preference. Fiat currency encourages high time preference, encourages people to spend more than what they receive by getting themselves into debt, spending, and not saving. Whereas sound money, by the purpose of it increasing its purchasing power each and every year, it encourages people to save more and not get into more debt. So that was the key nugget for me.
So thinking back to when you first got involved with Bitcoin, were there any sort of major incidents or crises going on in South Africa that really pushed you in the direction of Bitcoin and piqued your interest? What pulled you in?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was mainly what was happening politically that really solidified my position in Bitcoin. I mean, I explained earlier that the government is now trying to impose expropriation or compensation. That was the year, 2017 was the year where these policies started to show their faces. Like they
Right.
was outwardly talking about it. They were outwardly talking about taking people's pensions. They were outwardly talking about qualitative easing. In fact, one of the government officials called it qualitative. Qualitative. You just changed the name, but like, same thing. You changed the name, so. But it's the same thing. You're just printing money.
Yeah.
So that's what basically just gave me that extra edge and basically full throttled me into Bitcoin. But I'm not only interested in Bitcoin. I should specify that I'm also interested into gold. And there's a company here in South Africa called Troy Gold that essentially making it easier for people to buy gold. If you're aware of gold money, you just simply send your money to that particular wallet and you just buy gold, and that's it. To that account, and you buy gold, and that's it. Yeah, so I'm very much interested into gold and Bitcoin. So I'm not only a Bitcoin guy. I believe that there's also value in gold. I mean, gold has been here for, if I'm not mistaken, 6,000 years.
Yep.
So there's a lot of history behind gold. So that's why I'm also into gold as well as into Bitcoin.
So there are many people within the Bitcoin space that refer to Bitcoin as digital gold. Why would they have that view? No.
Yeah, so the reason why it's essentially called digital gold is that, so one of the one of the I would say disadvantages of gold is that it was heavy and very hard to transport. And so by banks essentially taking custodialship of the gold and giving you a check for you to spend that check somewhere else made that process easier. But the problem with that is that it made it very centralized, right? It made it very centralized, which made it easier for governments to co-opt gold. So the reason why Bitcoin is essentially called the digital gold is that you don't have that custodialship. Well, that's if you choose not to have it. If you have a hardware wallet, you essentially take it from the exchange and you put it in your hardware wallet, send it to your hardware wallet, and I believe that's why it's essentially called digital gold, because it has the same sound principles as gold, except that now it's on the internet.
What would you say are the economic principles? Because obviously that's what we're here to discuss, the economics of Bitcoin. Right. What are the key economic principles of Bitcoin?
So essentially the key principle with Bitcoin is that it is a deflationary. It gains purchasing power over a period of time, and can be used as a store of value. That essentially is the key takeaway with Bitcoin. I think that's why a lot of people are into Bitcoin, is that they're seeing a lot of them are seeing a lot of the country's currencies devaluing, and that's why they're into Bitcoin.
You speak a lot about sound money, and in some circles it's called hard money.
Yeah.
Why is the 21 million hard cap or maximum supply of Bitcoin so important to the protocol?
Yeah, so for that I would have to say that I'm not sure what's the particular reason behind the 21 million Bitcoins, but for any other currency, any unit is enough.
It could have been 100 million, or it could have been 41 million. Exactly. The fact that it's got a fixed hard supply.
That's what's important. That's essentially what is important. The fact that it's fixed. And the reason why that's important is that it essentially prevents it from moving away from being deflationary to now being inflationary. If you have a currency which essentially does not have a fixed cap, what that means is that that currency by effect is inflationary, right? If I would define what inflationary is, or what the proper term of what inflation is, it is essentially the creation of new currency or the new money. Like a perfect example is the rand, which is essentially the currency in South Africa. There's no fixed cap in the rand. Every year it increases and every year it increases, so that is inflationary. Whereas with Bitcoin, every year it decreases. Every 4 years, the new currency essentially gets cut in half, and decreases until you get to that 21 million. So that's why it's important, because that stops it from being inflationary.
Right, so we're talking digital scarcity, basically. Yeah.
Exactly, we're talking digital scarcity, and scarcity is very important. I mean, a lot of what governments are doing right now, they're trying to ignore scarcity. A lot of central banks, by cutting interest rates and by stimulating currency out of thin air, is trying to ignore the fundamental principle of economics, and that is scarcity. And Bitcoin respects scarcity.
100%. So, do you think the emergence of Bitcoin can potentially force governments, central banks to manage their monetary policy better. Is Bitcoin a threat?
Yeah, it definitely is. It is a threat. It is a threat to them because it would prevent them from doing what they're doing. With Bitcoin, you don't have a central bank creating currency.
Sure.
Uh,
Decentralized, yeah.
yeah, they essentially can't they can't centralize it. So it is very much a threat to them. It means that the government needs to balance their budgets. It means that they can't go overly in debt. For every revenue they received in government revenue, they need to match that with government expenditure. That means that they're going to have to cut on very popular policies like welfare and whatnot. And they don't like that because that's essentially for them, they campaign on that.
Yeah.
A lot of them, anyway. And so it prevent them from doing that. Essentially, Bitcoin will make governments and central banks irrelevant. And they should be relevant. I mean, we pay so much importance to these guys,
Sure.
and to me, it's actually quite scary. I mean, a few of government officials have the ability to essentially direct people's decisions, millions of people's decisions on a daily basis.
Yeah.
That's dangerous. That's central
Very.
planning. That's not good.
That's unchecked power when you really
Exactly.
look at it. What is your position on Bitcoin? Is it a safe haven asset? Is it peer-to-peer for peer-to-peer transactions? Is it an insurance policy against a potential global crisis? How do you see Bitcoin? It could be. Is it all of those things? How do you see
Yeah.
Bitcoin?
So I would define it mainly based on my context. Uh, right now, I'm seeing the same trends being followed, like in South Africa. We're seeing the same policies trying to be imposed that failed in other countries.
Right.
So for me, it's a safe haven. It's so that I can have my hard work, my hard-earned money in something that the government can't touch. Uh, so essentially, for me, the most important aspect of it is that I have full ownership of it. I have, I own it, and of course, with that comes responsibility and
Sure.
risk.
Yeah.
It could go down to zero. Who knows? Um, and it also comes with the responsibility of me making sure that I keep my private keys in check. I've backed up my private keys. I don't keep them digital. And even so, I think for your listeners, I have to emphasize this is that don't take your salary and put it all in Bitcoin. I don't think that's the smartest thing you can do.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say take small portions of it and allocate it to Bitcoin.
Okay.
But that's not financial advice.
Yeah.
Let me highlight that.
Throw that. This is not financial advice. So just in terms of Bitcoin, what is the South African's government stance towards Bitcoin? Is it a positive one? Or cryptocurrencies in general?
Yeah, so we haven't had like major discussions from the fiscal side of things, like government officials saying much about Bitcoin, but from a central bank perspective, we've had like very bad regulations. I think uh, there was a period in which I think the central bank was trying to essentially really clamp down on regulations on crypto exchanges in here in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
That would have made it hard for people to essentially acquire Bitcoin. I mean, we have capital gains. Essentially means that if you essentially buy Bitcoin and you sell it, you need to pay tax out
Wow.
of every transaction that you make, and that makes it very hard. That's yeah, that's the stupid regulation, and I don't think a lot of people follow it, which is good. It's a stupid regulation.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have these regulations. We also have exchange controls, which makes it a little bit more expensive to buy Bitcoin here than relatively to the States. Um, yeah. So on a monetary side of things, it's not looked at in a positive light necessarily, but there are financial institutions that are quite interested into Bitcoin. I could, for example, we could look at what Investec is doing. They quite interested in Bitcoin. They've hosted some Bitcoin events or one Bitcoin Invest. I think they even brought Tony Vanes this last year. If I'm not,
Okay.
was it last year or early this? It was last year. No, it was this year before the lockdown. So there's interest, I believe, in the commercial side of things of Bitcoin, but in terms of regulatory framework, nah, it's viewed as a threat.
So, recent sort of major transactions, such as MicroStrategy CEO Michael Saylor recently investing 250 million into Bitcoin,
Yeah.
as well as Squares through
Jack Dorsey,
yeah, through Jack Dorsey. Uh, have those kind of strengthened your view on Bitcoin that you are doing the right thing, or yeah, how's that made you feel? I like to ask Bitcoiners.
I honestly, if I'm honest with you, I would like them to actually trash Bitcoin because it would make the price more cheap. With them buying
Yes.
it, essentially, with them buying it, even though I do welcome it, for me, it's just because I'm selfish with Bitcoin. I'd like it to become cheaper so that I can
Of course.
exchange my fiat for it over time. So it's very like, yeah, it does reinforce my opinion on it. I just like it when they bash it more. I like
Yeah.
it when billionaires
Yeah,
I
I
like it
think
when billionaires just talk trash about Bitcoin,
yeah, I think
and
you
like
need to probably
and the investors listen to them, and I say, yeah, yeah, go ahead, stupid. I'm buying this.
well, you've got Peter Schiff and JP Morgan's what's his name, Jamie
Yeah,
Dimon for
Jamie
that.
Dimon. Yeah,
They're always ready
yeah.
to do that.
And I use that as a signal. I
Yeah.
honestly use that as a signal.
Oh,
As soon as
really?
I hear, yeah, as soon as I hear a lot of talking by these guys saying that you shouldn't buy Bitcoin, then I get worried and I buy more Bitcoin because something else is going on.
Okay, I'm gonna start doing that too. Just a few more questions before I let you go. Then, so I guess obviously you're the next generation. The people your age with your outlook are going to be taking your country, so South Africa and the African continent, forward. What are your views for and predictions for Bitcoin over the sort of next 5 to 20 years? Where do you see this going?
Oh man, there's a lot of things going on in Bitcoin. I mean, there was this day when I just, for 3 days, I think I was just busy with schoolwork, and a lot has happened there in terms of innovation happening in Bitcoin. Like a lot of stuff that I missed in those 3 days, and I'm still catching up even today.
Mm.
I believe in the space, we're gonna see a lot more interest from people. I mean, like the average person going through today's life, things are getting a lot more expensive than what they were.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, any grandparent will tell you that things back in the past were a lot cheaper than what they are today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's going to cause people to start questioning things, and those questions will lead them more towards Bitcoin. So I think we're going to see a lot more adoption. I know that's cliche. I'm sorry to give you a cliche answer.
Yes, I know it's fair. It's fair to your view.
But I think that we're gonna see a lot more people starting to acquire Bitcoin, even to a certain extent. I mean, a lot of people I have heard of Bitcoin. Like, if you ask the next person, yeah, like, have you heard about Bitcoin? They'd say yes.
Mm-hmm.
But now the next stage needs to be about, okay, now you need to learn about Bitcoin, which is why I find stuff that you do very quite honorable, man. Like, you're educating like newbies, and I'm a newbie as well. I'm still learning.
Me too.
To essentially make it easier
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
To essentially make it easier for them to buy Bitcoin. So we're going to see a lot of that. We're going to see a lot of these companies essentially innovate around Bitcoin and whatnot.
So, do you ever foresee a situation of hyper Bitcoinization, say where Bitcoin becomes a reserve currency used in combination with I don't know another fiat currency, or just becomes the reserve currency for the world? Do you think that's potential to happen?
Not in terms of government standards. I'm not particularly sure if I would see a government stating that Bitcoin is now the reserve currency. Where I would see that is mostly on a day-to-day, individual to individual basis. In other words, free markets. I would see that a lot of companies trading more in Bitcoin. Not now. I think in a few more years to come. I think we're still very early. But I don't think that from a government perspective would see like them stating, okay, we're gonna now say Bitcoin is our reserve currency.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I don't think the governments have learnt their lesson coming off the gold standard. I think they're still repeating.
Do you not even see like a small country, maybe a small country in the background, which is just slowly, quietly amassing Bitcoin? It could potentially change the direction of a whole country. So
yeah. So in that, I have to emphasize it depends on the ideology of that government.
Okay.
If the government is very centrally focused,
Yeah.
then I do not see that happening.
Yeah.
But if that government is mostly free market orientated, then I'd see that happening.
Okay.
So it could happen. It could happen. I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible.
Yeah.
But it depends on the ideology of that government.
Now, just in terms of gaining from some of your experience, what advice can you give to anyone who wants to get into this space, who wants to learn about Bitcoin, about cryptocurrency, about blockchain? What advice do you have in terms of things that they can read, people to follow? Any advice?
Reading recommendations would be The Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing about Bitcoin is that I also like to think of it as like a Trojan horse, in that if you get into it, I like to think of it as a Trojan horse of knowledge.
Yeah.
As soon as you get to it, you start to question everything, and you would need to learn about everything else. So
it's like where Neo took was it the red pill or the blue pill in the Matrix? It opens your eyes to so many things, and you can't unsee them after that. You cannot unsee them.
Exactly. No, I completely agree with you, man. So when you get into that, when you start to see the Matrix, then I'd say that my next recommendation for you is that to essentially start to get an interest in Austrian economics. Just read a little bit of Austrian economics. A book recommendation that I recommend people to read is Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt.
Mm-hmm.
And then follow the Mises Institute. Look at their YouTube channel. That'll give you a sound grounding of economics. People to follow, I'd say Saifedean, and I'm gonna mention someone here in South Africa actually. Chris Bakker.
Chris Bakker, okay.
Search Chris Bakker. Even let me write it down for you. Is that a chat option here? Chris Bakker is one of the guys here leading innovation here in the Bitcoin space here in South Africa.
Cool.
He works at Investec, which is a commercial bank here in South Africa. So I'd say give him a follow. Chris Bakker, of course, Saifedean Ammous. And also follow Crypto Twitter. Sometimes I don't like Crypto Twitter, but
it's too much sometimes, man.
It's too much sometimes. I get it, but I mean, I always like to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah. I think it gets quite tribal as well. I mean, you've got Ethereum people. Like, come on, man. Like, there's people who just want to eat food. Like, come on, there's bigger fish to fry. But
exactly, there's so many. There's a bigger picture, and I feel like at times we they're fussing over small stuff.
Yeah.
Where you not looking at what other people in other countries are going through.
Yeah.
Get this
100%.
thing to them.
Yes.
Just get it to them.
Yes. 100%.
That's it.
100%.
Just do that, and you're done.
Yeah.
Then you can fuss afterwards.
Okay, cool. Bheki, before we let you go, where can people find you? Where can people engage with you on social media? Yeah, tell us where we can find you.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, but I'm not active.
Yeah, I noticed that.
I'm not really active, mainly because I'm particularly busy with school. But then you can always send me a DM. I always respond to DMs. So my Twitter handle is at @MAHLABO_BEKHI. I'll spell it for you at MAHLOBO_BEKHI BHEKI.
Yep.
That's where you'll find me on Twitter, and pop me a DM. I'm also starting to write more. Not necessarily.
Yes, we need an article from Bheki. We need an article from Bheki. When can we see that? That was my next question.
Yeah, definitely. I mostly write for South African media, but I will definitely try to be a little more out there in terms of Bitcoin magazines and whatnot, Bitcoin websites. So I'll try a little bit more on that. But yeah, Twitter's the best place to reach me. Send me a DM.
Definitely. Well, Bheki, I just want to thank you for your time and appreciate it. And definitely, I'm going to have you on again once this Bitcoin thing starts to heat up, because I think it will. So we will engage, and we'll definitely do a trip. I say it will. I will come to Johannesburg very soon. It is meant to be one of the places to definitely come and see. So we'll put that in the diary after all this COVID nonsense has gone away, hopefully.
Yeah, perfect, man. I'd love to have you here and show you around.
Brilliant.
Thank you for having me, and I truly appreciate it, man.
What do you think? This is definitely going down as one of the shows that I've learnt so much. I'll probably put this up there with the show with Benny Overton. And with all the turmoil in the world, coming across such a young, intelligent guy like Bheki really fills you with confidence that the world might just be a better place in the future. So what are my major takeaways from this show? Today actually felt like a lecture for me. A little different to the shows that I normally do, but I actually felt like I was a student and Bheki was actually teaching me. And I'll be honest, until I came into the Bitcoin world, I had never heard of Austrian Economics. And I'm someone, again, who got a C, again, which is a decent grade in the UK for A-levels. And I'm talking about old A-levels, not the new A-levels that everybody gets A stars and distinctions on, well, that's another story for another day. This show really kind of made me feel like, you know what, I need to read more. I definitely need to read more, and I need to really open my mind. And Bheki has really suggested a number of things I can read to really improve my understanding of alternative schools of economics, because economics is fundamentally how our world is governed. I mean, I've got so many takeaways from today's show, but what I would say impressed me the most is how Bheki linked economics, the economics of Bitcoin, to what's happening in the wider world, and in fact, what's happening in South Africa as we speak. It sounds like South Africa is about to release some really draconian laws on their population, and it's probably something that's happening all across the globe. So guys, we probably need to do a bit more reading and understanding of some of the new laws that are being introduced in our respective countries. It really feels at this moment in time that the world is going through a shift. I'm not sure what it is. I call it a changing of the guard. It's a time where the post-World War II babies are starting to either retire or die, to keep it real. Those who have built up and amassed wealth are starting to hand it over to their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren. And their great-grandchildren have totally different mindsets of what is value and what is valuable. Right now, the world is a scary place, but it's also a very exciting one. And I'm definitely filled with optimism. So guys, if you want to follow Bheki or read any of his recommendations, I'll put all his information in the show notes. Make sure you check him out. Make sure you reach out to him. This is a kid that's going places, and hopefully he can be a friend of the show moving forward. Thanks for listening. This is Genesis Block Education.